Grandpa,
Yes,
can you tell me about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan.
Yes.
For most of the 20th century, Afghanistan was ruled by a constitutional monarchy, although by the 1960s the growth in communism within government led to radical tensions between the parties. On one side you had the moderate faction represented by the Parcham, who sought mass support, while the more radical Khalq faction sought to mirror themselves off a Leninist-style regime similar to that of the Soviet Union. A coup d'etat occurred on July 17, 1973, that saw former Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan seize power and ended the rule of the monarchy. Although Daoud portrayed himself as a reformer, few were ever implemented, and his regime grew more oppressive over time, eventually culminating in the Saud Revolution, that saw the Afghan military overthrow and execute Daoud on April 27, 1978. Nemanja, this is Radio Moscow reporting breaking news from the front. On December 27, 1979, our glorious Soviet soldiers secured the Afghan capital of Kabul from the counter-revolutionary forces. Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace in the night and executed the traitorous President Amin for anti-communist behavior, therefore freeing the Afghan people from his corrupt and tyrannical rule. Thousands of our soldiers are pouring into Afghanistan as we speak, and soon the Afghan people will be liberated so a true communist revolution can begin. Unpopular reforms saw mass uprisings occur throughout the country, with widespread chaos and lawlessness ravaging the nation as the government and rebel forces fought over control of the area. Afghan President Amin in the years prior requested repeated Soviet aid in order to crush the Mujahideen rebels, resulting in more Soviet equipment and manpower pouring into the nation. However, by April of 1978, Amin's loyalty to the USSR was questioned, as he was suspected of purging loyalists in his government and was possibly establishing diplomatic links to nations unfriendly to the Soviets, such as Pakistan and the People's Republic of China. By the fall of 1979, there were active calls from the top officials in the Soviet government requesting for an invasion of Afghanistan in order to remove Amin from power, as well as preventing an Islamist regime from gaining power in the country. As the situation continued to deteriorate, the Soviets increased their presence by sending in large numbers of airborne forces at the end of December to reinforce the ground troops present in the country. On December 27, 1979, the Soviets striked, with soldiers dressed in Afghan uniforms occupying key military, government, and communication buildings within Kabul. The primary objective was to seize the Tajbek presidential palace, which they succeeded in capturing, and in their raid they were also able to kill President Amin. Soon afterwards, they installed a puppet regime under former Deputy Prime Minister Babrak Karmal. At the same time, the Soviets began a mission to occupy the country, where in the opening days of the war, 80,000 soldiers, along with thousands of armored vehicles and aircraft, entered Afghanistan. The Soviet occupation had the opposite effect in that it exacerbated tensions in the region, leading to further outbreaks of unrest and rebellion throughout the country. At this time, an Islamic Afghan resistance movement formed known as the Mujahideen, with their sole goal of keeping Afghanistan free from the Soviet invasion by fighting a holy war against the invaders known as Jihad. Although the Soviets occupied the major urban centers, the Mujahideen waged guerrilla war, forming small localized groups that operated in the largely rural regions of Afghanistan. The Soviets struggled with this insurgent style of warfare, where no matter how many Mujahideen bases they destroyed or captured, the enemy would always return as soon as they left, and it was impossible for the Soviet troops to control the entire country effectively. The USSR followed three main strategies to deal with the Mujahideen, with the first being intimidation, where their forces would target villages, livestock, and crops. It was hoped that by instilling fear in the local populace, it would scare the villagers from providing safe havens to the insurgents. This strategy was brutal, as the Soviets often launched daily attacks, which would result in numerous civilian casualties that made life in the villages unbearable. The second strategy was subversion, where Soviet spies would infiltrate resistance groups to gather intelligence, as well as bribing local tribes to fight against the Mujahideen. The last Soviet strategy was direct combat operations, where Soviet units would embark on search and destroy missions to expel the guerrillas from contested regions. In these missions, the Soviets would often occupy the local villages, where they would either interrogate the inhabitants for information on Mujahideen movements, or outright kill them and burn the village. The international community was also outraged by this invasion, with a multitude of countries providing military assistance to the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviet invaders. Some of the key contributors were the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, along with China, who at the time had poor relations with the Soviets, and used this as a way to get back at them for their interference in Asia. Of these allies to the Mujahideen, the ones to contribute the most financially were America and Saudi Arabia, with each providing large stockpiles of military weapons to the Mujahideen. Under the Reagan administration, the US invested $20 billion into the war in Afghanistan, where they armed the Mujahideen with American anti-air Stinger missiles, as well as aiding in the training of Mujahideen fighters. On a historical note, a myth has developed around the Stinger missile, where it was said to have shot down scores of Soviet helicopters and aircraft, turning the tide of the war in the Mujahideen's favor. In reality, it did have some initial success, but the Soviets quickly outfitted their aircraft and helicopters with countermeasures, and developed tactics to combat the Stinger threat. Yes, it did inflict losses on the Soviets, but it did not have a major influence in the war. The one to contribute the most throughout the war was actually the British, who chose to insert MI6 and SAS teams to train resistance fighters near the Afghan border in Pakistan. Along with supplementing the training of resistance fighters for the Mujahideen, the British supplied Lee Enfield rifles, taken from old Indian stocks, and these were used in great numbers, unlike the blowpipe launchers, a surface-to-air missile system that was quickly ditched as it was deemed both too expensive and unreliable for use. The blowpipe missile launcher was ditched in favor of the American Stinger anti-air launcher, that proved to be far more reliable and considerably cheaper than its British counterpart. While not as involved in the arms trade, the Chinese were crucial in equipping and training the Mujahideen forces in their war against the Soviet occupiers. As the tensions between China and America eased at the start of the 1980s, the Americans supplied the Chinese forces with American equipment in order to bring the two nations closer. It also increased the amount of supplies that would go towards supplying the Mujahideen forces as they continued with their fight against the Soviets. The Chinese contributed the most in arms, with most of the Mujahideen utilizing Chinese assault rifles and machine guns. Along with the British, the Chinese People's Liberation Army aided in the training of the Mujahideen in Xinjiang, as well as along the Pakistani border. By the late 1980s, the unsatisfactory results in Afghanistan sparked calls within Soviet command for the withdrawal from Afghanistan. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1985, a major shift in foreign policy also occurred, where it all but ensured that there would be a Soviet withdrawal. The start of the withdrawal of Soviet troops began in mid-1987, lasting for 2 years, where the last soldiers left in February 1989. The puppet Afghan regime under President Karmal was largely ineffective, and as the Soviets left the country, his legitimacy and rule gradually weakened as Mujahideen influence grew. Key factors in the failure of the Soviet occupation was due to the fact that this was simply not a style of warfare they were used to. The Soviets, like the Americans in Vietnam, focused on fighting a conventional war, but in the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, large troop movements were simply not possible. Likewise, the Mujahideen waged a guerrilla style of warfare, where their hit-and-run tactics were incredibly effective against Soviet forces who struggled to deal with multiple small groups of insurgents. Lastly, the Soviet troops just weren't motivated to fight in such a war. Many soldiers were conscripts who were forced to serve in Afghanistan, and the poor conditions of the country made it harder to combat the Mujahideen. Ultimately, the Soviet war in Afghanistan was a costly one, both financially and numerically. The Soviet Union spent $50 billion equivalent to about $115 billion today on the war, which was a key factor that led to the collapse of the USSR only 2 years later. Of the 620,000 soldiers that served in Afghanistan at some point, 15,000 died in the war, while 54,000 were wounded. On top of that, poor sanitary conditions and just the overall undeveloped region of Afghanistan meant that a further 416,000 became sick. Just like the Americans a decade earlier in Vietnam, the Soviets failed to adopt a new style of warfare, which emphasized small-scale skirmishes over large decisive battles of attrition, and as a result, poured large amount of resources into a war they just didn't know how to win. With the defeat of the Soviets, Afghanistan claimed yet another victim to its graveyard of empires.